The text message arrived at exactly 11:47 on a Tuesday night. It was from a number I did not recognize. It said, simply, "Do not sign anything your son gives you this week." I did not panic. I did not call him to demand an explanation. I just walked into my dark kitchen, poured a hot cup of Earl Grey tea, and sat at my table, watching the blue light of my phone screen fade to black. 3 days later, my son walked through my front door carrying a thick stack of legal documents that would have entirely destroyed my life. Before I tell you what was actually inside those papers, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight. I always love reading where this community is tuning in from. My name is Cordelia. I am 68 years old. For almost 4 decades, I worked as a fraud investigator for one of the largest insurance firms in the country. I spent my entire career finding the one single lie buried beneath thousands of pages of perfectly crafted legal jargon. I just never expected that the most dangerous piece of paper I would ever have to audit would be handed to me by my own child. Things started shifting after my husband passed away 5 years ago. The house got quiet. The visits from my son, David, became rare and rushed. When he did come over, he almost always brought his wife, Elena. Elena had this very specific way of walking into my home. She would drop her heavy, overpriced designer handbag right onto my antique oak dining table like she already owned the place. She would sigh loudly, check her watch, and look around my living room like it was nothing more than a waiting area for her future inheritance. David would just stand there, nervously tapping his fingers against his coffee mug, refusing to make eye contact with me. They started treating me like a fragile, fading old woman. Elena would smile this thin, pitying smile and say things like, "Cordelia, you really should not burden yourself with understanding the estate anymore. The financial world is just too complex for someone your age." I never raised my voice. I never corrected her. I simply listened to them. And because I stayed quiet, they made the fatal mistake of assuming I was weak. They mistook my silence for surrender. They believed, with absolute unassailable certainty, that I was just going to smile and sign my life away. My husband, Robert, built our life on a foundation of quiet and steady labor. He was a good man. When he passed away 5 years ago, the silence he left behind in our home was incredibly heavy. It was the kind of silence that actually rings in your ears at night. I thought my son, David, would be the one to help me fill that quiet space. For a little while, he tried. He would come over on Sunday mornings, drink black coffee from his father's old chipped mug, and help me with the yard work. We would talk about his dreams and his ambitions for his new accounting firm. He was hungry for success, and I was genuinely proud of him. But success is a very strange thing. When it comes too fast, it does not just change what you drive or where you live. It changes the way you look at the people who knew you before you had anything. David's firm took off. He started making real money. The kind of money that makes people forget the actual value of a single hard-earned dollar. And shortly after that, he married Elena. Elena was not an inherently evil person, but she was a profoundly empty one. She came from a world that measured human worth entirely by the logo stamped on a piece of luggage. The very first time David brought her to my house for Thanksgiving dinner, she did not look at my home as a place of warmth or history. She looked at it like an outdated museum exhibit that she was being forced to tour. She stepped onto my front porch wearing shoes that likely cost more than my very first car. I remember the melting snow dripping off her expensive wool coat, creating a dirty little puddle on my cheap linoleum entryway floor. She did not apologize. She did not offer to take her boots off. She just walked right into my kitchen, dropped her heavy leather designer handbag directly onto the center of Robert's antique oak dining table, and let out a long breath. It was a very specific kind of sigh. The kind that communicates, immediately and clearly, that your mere presence is an exhausting obligation to them. I offered her a warm cup of coffee. She looked at my old drip coffee maker, gave a tight little smile, and politely declined, pulling a bottle of imported spring water from her bag instead. I did not take offense. I spent 40 years auditing corporate fraud. I have sat across the table from millionaire embezzlers, corrupt executives, and men who truly thought they owned the world. I learned very early in my career that arrogance is almost always a mask for deep insecurity. So, I just smiled back and welcomed her to our family. Over the next few years, the subtle disrespect only grew. The Sunday morning visits stopped entirely. They were replaced by mandatory, rushed holiday dinners where I was treated much more like a fragile houseguest than the matriarch of the family. David changed completely. The boy who used to wear denim and laugh loudly now wore tailored charcoal suits and checked his phone every 2 minutes. He developed this nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his coffee cup, a constant and impatient rhythm that screamed how badly he wanted to be somewhere else any time we were in the same room. He stopped asking me for advice. He started speaking to me slowly, using that soft, patronizing tone people use when they are trying to explain a simple concept to a toddler. They started leaving me out of important family decisions. When my grandson was born, I was not invited to the hospital. Elena told me later that they just did not want to expose a newborn to the germs of an elderly visitor. It stung deeply, but I swallowed my pride. I wanted a relationship with my grandchild more than I wanted to be right. But the absolute worst of it happened last autumn. They stopped by my house unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. David was pacing in my living room, talking on his phone about a massive real estate trust his firm was handling. When he hung up, he looked incredibly stressed. I poured him a glass of water and asked a very simple, standard question about the tax implications of the zoning laws involved in his deal. I had spent my entire adult life dismantling multi-million-dollar shell companies and tracking hidden assets. I knew exactly how those zoning loopholes worked. But before David could even process my question, Elena stepped in. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply against my hardwood floor. She gave me that thin, pitying smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She reached out, patted my hand gently as if I were a lost child wandering a department store, and spoke. "Cordelia," she said, "you really should not burden yourself with understanding the estate or these heavy business matters anymore. The modern financial world is just too complex for someone your age. It is best to just let David handle the heavy lifting from now on. Why do you not just focus on your gardening and let us worry about the numbers?" I did not react. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind her that I had uncovered offshore bank accounts that the federal government had missed. I did not tell her that my mind was sharper and faster than hers would ever be. I simply listened. I looked at the way she held her expensive purse, clutching it tightly against her chest like a shield, completely unaware of how transparent her arrogance truly was. And then I looked at David, my son, the boy I had raised to respect hard work, honesty, and family above all else. He just stood there. He let her say it. He let her diminish my entire life of hard-won expertise down to a cute little hobby for a fading old woman. He let out another long, exhausted sigh, checked his expensive watch, and told Elena they needed to leave before the highway traffic got bad. That was the exact moment I realized the boy I raised was gone. In his place was a man who only respected power and money, and who firmly believed I possessed neither. They thought my quiet demeanor meant my mind was failing. They thought because I lived in a modest home and wore plain clothes, I was weak and defenseless. They did not understand that I was an investigator. My entire career was built on sitting quietly in the background, letting arrogant people talk, letting them feel incredibly smart and completely in control, right up until the exact moment I laid the undeniable evidence on the table and dismantled their entire lives in one swift motion. I never wanted to use those professional skills on my own flesh and blood. But as I sat alone in my dark kitchen that night, staring at the anonymous warning message glowing on my phone screen, I knew the time for being a gentle, accommodating mother had officially passed. The game was already in motion. Someone was trying to destroy my life. And that someone was my own son. I just had to figure out exactly what kind of trap he was trying to walk me into. The glowing screen of my phone felt incredibly heavy in my hand. 11:47 at night. I sat there in the dark of my kitchen, letting the blue light wash over the worn wooden table. And I read that single line of text again. Do not sign anything your son gives you this week. It was a local area code, but I knew that meant absolutely nothing these days. I did not try to call the number back. I did not type out a frantic reply asking who this was. I certainly did not call my son. I just sat perfectly still and listened to the rhythmic humming of the refrigerator. I knew a burner phone when I saw one. Somebody was reaching out from the shadows. Somebody who had intimate access to my son's schedule, his private plans, and his immediate intentions, and more importantly, somebody who was terrified enough of him, or perhaps the people he worked with, to hide their own identity completely. I finished my tea. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The bitter taste grounded me. I walked out of the kitchen and down the long, dark hallway toward Robert's old study. The floorboards creaked under my feet. They always had to, right near the doorway. Robert used to joke that it was our built-in security system. Tonight, that small, the familiar sound just reminded me of how entirely alone I was in this big house, and how vulnerable that made me look to the outside world. For a brief, fleeting moment, the mother in me desperately tried to rationalize the message. Maybe it was a scam. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe someone was just playing a very cruel, very specific joke on an old woman. But you do not survive 4 decades auditing corporate fraud by ignoring red flags. You do not catch the liars by giving them the benefit of the doubt. You survive by pulling the loose thread until the whole ugly sweater unravels. Standing in the hallway, I made a choice. The mother in my mind, the one who wanted to bake cookies and believe her son was a good man, went to sleep. The investigator woke up. She was completely, absolutely cold. I opened the heavy oak door of the study and turned on the small brass desk lamp. It cast a warm, yellow pool of light across the leather blotter. I sat down in Robert's old chair. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the familiar smell of old paper, binding glue, and dust fill my lungs. Then, I went to work. I reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out the heavy, fireproof metal lockbox. It contained every vital piece of paper connected to my existence. Birth certificates, the deed to the house, Robert's life insurance policies, the titles to the cars, and the ironclad will Robert and I had drafted together over a decade ago. I laid them all out on the desk, arranging them in perfectly neat, chronological rows. I spent the next 4 hours doing a complete forensic audit of my own life. I checked every single account balance. I reviewed the property taxes. I read through the fine print of my pension plan. I looked for vulnerabilities. I looked for any possible, illogical reason that my son would need my signature on a legal document this week. There was absolutely none. The house was entirely paid off. There were no outstanding liens. The property taxes were automatically deducted from a high-yield savings account that had more than enough money to cover the next 20 years. My medical insurance was comprehensive and fully funded. There was no financial emergency. There was no sudden tax crisis. There was no unexpected liability that required any sort of restructuring. Everything Robert and I had built was perfectly secure, which left only one terrifying conclusion. If the fortress is completely secure from the outside, the only way to breach it is to get the person holding the keys to open the front door from the inside. He did not need my signature to protect me from anything. He needed my signature to remove my protection. He needed me to voluntarily sign away my rights, my ownership, or my autonomy. I sat there in the quiet study, running through the possibilities in my head. A transfer of deed, a new power of attorney, a medical proxy that would allow him to declare me unfit, or maybe an irrevocable trust that would completely strip me of my ability to control my own money. I leaned back in the chair. The sun was just starting to come up, painting the sky outside the study window in pale shades of gray and purple. The house was freezing, and my joints were stiff from sitting for so long. But my mind was sharper and faster than it had been in years. He felt a strange, chilling sense of calm wash over me. It is the exact kind of calm that only comes when the confusion finally clears, and you see the battlefield for exactly what it is. David and Elena thought I was a fragile old woman sitting in a dusty house, waiting for them to manage my life. They thought I would see a stack of complicated legal documents, shrink back in confusion, and gratefully hand over the pen. They thought I would trust my son blindly, simply because he shared my blood. They forgot what I did for a living. I spent my entire career sitting in quiet rooms exactly like this one, dissecting the lies of desperate, greedy men. I knew how to read the fine print. I knew how to spot a hidden clause buried on page 47 of a 50-page contract. I knew how to follow the money. And I knew how to set a trap. I carefully gathered up all the documents, placed them back into the fireproof box, and locked it tight. I slid it back into the bottom drawer. I turned off the brass lamp. The morning light was strong enough now to illuminate the room on its own. I walked back into the kitchen and started a fresh pot of coffee. I did not feel fear anymore. I did not even feel the crushing heartbreak of a mother realizing her child was plotting against her. That pain would come later. I knew that for a fact. But right now, there was absolutely no room for grief. There was only room for strategy. I was going to wait. I was going to let him come to my house. I was going to let him present his lies. I would look him in the eye. I would listen to his carefully rehearsed script. And I would let him believe he was winning. The message said he would come this week. I was ready for him. It was Thursday afternoon, exactly at 2 o'clock. When the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the quiet house. That was exactly 3 days after the anonymous message illuminated my phone in the dark. I was standing at the kitchen counter, slowly pouring myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. When I heard the sound, David never came over on a Thursday. He certainly never came over in the middle of the workday. I walked to the foyer and opened the door. There stood my son. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, the kind that costs more than a reliable used car. The very first thing that hit me was his cologne. It was heavy, sharp, and incredibly expensive. It completely flooded my entryway, instantly overpowering the warm, familiar smell of my coffee. He looked immaculate. But beneath the expensive fabric and the perfectly styled hair, he looked frantic. He was carrying a thick, brown leather briefcase. He gripped the handle so tightly that his knuckles were actually turning white. "Mom," he said, letting out a heavy breath as he pushed past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. I know this is entirely unannounced, but I was just in the area meeting with a major client, and I needed to drop by. We have a bit of a time-sensitive situation to handle. I closed the door quietly. I did not ask him what was wrong. I did not offer him a drink. I simply followed him back into the kitchen and watched as he set his briefcase down on my wooden table. The heavy metal clasps snapped open with a loud, sharp click that made me flinch just a fraction. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of legal documents. It had to be at least 50 pages thick. Bound with a massive black clip, he laid the stack onto the table and smoothed his hand over the top page. He would not look me in the eye. That was the absolute first tell. "Listen, Mom," he started, his voice dropping into that soft, patronizing tone he and Elena loved to use on me. "I have been going over the estate with my legal team. The new tax laws that are rolling out next quarter are going to be absolutely brutal on property owners like you. We are talking about massive tax hits. Dad would have wanted us to be smart about this. He worked too hard for this house, for us to just hand a massive chunk of its value over to the government because we were too slow to act." He finally looked up, flashing me a tight, rehearsed smile. "It is just a standard asset restructuring," he continued, his words flowing perfectly, like a script he had practiced in the mirror all morning. "Just a simple formality. Really. It moves the title of the house and your primary accounts into a protective shelter. But my lawyer needs to file this before the end of the business day on Friday to lock in the current tax rate. I know it is a lot of paper, but I really need you to just sign on the dotted lines today so I can get this handled and out of your way." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. He set it gently on top of the documents, right next to the little yellow sticky notes that said, "Sign here. Manufactured urgency." It is the absolute oldest trick in the Fraud Investigator Handbook, but when a corrupt executive or a desperate embezzler wants you to make a fatal mistake, they never give you time to think. They create a sudden, terrifying crisis, and then they generously offer you the one single escape route. They tell you that you have to act right this very second, or everything will collapse entirely. They bank on your panic. They rely entirely on your fear to blind you to the fine print. The documents themselves looked incredibly intimidating. That was also by design. Pages and pages of dense, unreadable legal jargon meant to exhaust the reader before they ever reached the clauses that actually mattered. I spent 40 years sitting across from professional liars. I knew every single physical tell a human body gives away when a person is standing on the edge of a massive deception. I watched David closely. He was trying to project absolute confidence, but his body was screaming a completely different story. His left foot was shifting slightly back and forth on my linoleum floor. A flight response. His breathing was incredibly shallow. And then there were his fingers. His right hand was resting on the table, and his index finger was tapping out a rapid, erratic rhythm against the wood. Tap, 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 tap. It was a nervous habit he had developed in high school whenever he was caught lying about his grades. He was terrified, not of the government, not of tax laws. He was terrified of me actually reading what was on those 50 pages. Dad would have wanted us to be smart about this. He actually used He used the memory of his hard-working H's, hen 5 honest father as a weapon to manipulate me. A cold, sharp wave of disgust washed over my chest. It took every single ounce of my professional discipline to keep my face completely blank. The mother inside me wanted to scream. She wanted to pick up that heavy stack of lies and throw it directly at his chest. She wanted to ask him how he could possibly stand in the home his father built and try to steal it out from under me. But the investigator stayed completely in control. The investigator knew that if I confronted him now, he would just grab the papers, run away, and find a different, more secretive way to destroy me. I needed the evidence. I needed to hold the paperwork in my own hands. I looked down at the gold pen. Then I looked at the thick stack of paper. I reached out and let my fingers graze the edge of the documents. The silence in the kitchen stretched out for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. I could hear the rapid ticking of the wall clock. I could hear David's sharp, shallow breaths. He was waiting for me to pick up the pen. He was waiting for the fragile, clueless old woman to do exactly what she was told. I did not pick up the pen. I looked down at the heavy gold pen sitting on top of the documents. Then I looked at my son. His right hand was hovering just a few inches above the table, completely ready for me to take the bait. I let the silence stretch out for a long time. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. It is truly amazing what people will voluntarily reveal about themselves when you simply refuse to fill the empty, quiet air. Finally, I pulled my hands back from the table and folded them neatly in my lap. I gave him a very soft, very gentle smile. It was the exact kind of smile a mother gives, a toddler who has just proudly presented a messy finger painting. "You know, David," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any sharp edges. My eyes just are not what they used to be. Especially this late in the afternoon. The light in here is not great. And you know exactly how your father was about signing legal papers without reading every single page twice. He would absolutely roll over in his grave if I just blindly signed a 50-page document without pouring a fresh cup of coffee and sitting down to actually read it first. Leave it right here on the table. I will look it over tonight when the house is quiet. And I will call you tomorrow morning. I watched his face with the trained eye of an investigator. For a fraction of a second, absolute panic flashed across his features. The carefully rehearsed script he had been running in his head all morning had suddenly hit a massive concrete wall. He opened his mouth to argue, to push that manufactured, false urgency just a little bit harder. I could literally see the words forming on his lips. He was going to tell me that his high-priced lawyer needed it immediately. He was going to say the tax deadline was looming dangerously close. He was going to insist that I was putting the entire family estate at massive financial risk by delaying even a few hours. But then, he stopped himself. He looked at my soft, unassuming smile. He looked at my faded gray cardigan. He looked around my modest kitchen with its old wooden cabinets and the worn linoleum floor. And in that exact, critical moment, his overwhelming arrogance completely overtook his fear. I could see him mentally calculating the risk. He told himself that I was just a tired, slow old woman who desperately wanted to feel like she was still in charge of her own life. He told himself that I would probably only read the first 2 or 3 pages, get entirely overwhelmed by the complex legal jargon, and simply sign the back page just to be done with the headache. He mistook my calm, quiet demeanor for absolute, blissful ignorance. He believed, with the exact same unassailable certainty that had driven his entire lucrative career, that he had already won. The physical transformation in his body was absolutely immediate. The frantic, nervous tapping of his index finger against the wood completely stopped. The rigid, defensive tension in his shoulders melted away like ice on a warm stove. He let out a long, theatrical breath, smoothly transitioning back into playing the role of the patient. Incredibly accommodating son. "Of course, Mom," he said. His voice instantly dropped back into that smooth, patronizing tone he and Elena loved so much. "Take your time. Just try to get it done by tomorrow afternoon so I can have my courier come pick it up directly from the house. It really is just standard boilerplate stuff. A lot of boring legal speak. but I completely understand if you want to feel comfortable with it first." He reached out, picked up his heavy gold fountain pen, and slid it gracefully back into the silk-lined inside pocket of his expensive suit. He snapped his brown leather briefcase shut with a sharp, final click. He leaned over the table and gave me a stiff, entirely obligatory kiss on the cheek. His heavy, expensive cologne clung to my skin, completely masking the warm, comforting smell of the dark roast coffee I had just poured. "Call me when you are done," he said, flashing me one last, practiced, perfectly symmetrical smile. I walked him to the front door. I stood on the porch and watched quietly as he walked down the driveway. His stride was completely different now. He was no longer the frantic, terrified man who had banged on my door just 15 minutes ago. He was walking with the easy, loose confidence of a corporate executive who had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal. He climbed into his black sports car. The engine roared to life with a deep, aggressive purr that shattered the quiet. Late afternoon, peace of my neighborhood. I watched the bright red taillights disappear around the corner at the end of the street. I did not wave. I did not move a single muscle until the street was completely silent again. Then, I turned around, walked back into my house, and firmly locked the front door, sliding the heavy deadbolt into place. I went straight back to the kitchen and stood over the thick stack of papers sitting exactly where he had left them. The false triumph is an incredibly beautiful thing to witness. I saw it 100 times in my career. When a corrupt executive or a desperate liar firmly believes they have successfully deceived you, they become incredibly sloppy. They stop looking over their shoulder. They stop covering their tracks. They exhale, drop their guard, and give you all the time and all the space you could ever possibly need to quietly dismantle their entire world. I did not need reading glasses. I did not need a fresh cup of coffee to keep my mind sharp. I needed absolute silence, a clear desk, and a red pen. I picked up the heavy stack of documents, feeling the dense weight of my son's betrayal in my hands. I carried them straight down the hall into Robert's old study, and I turned on the brass desk lamp for the second time that day. It was finally time to find out exactly how much my own flesh and blood thought my life was worth. Down to the very last penny. I left the thick stack of legal documents sitting right in the center of Robert's old leather desk blotter. I did not open them right away. I did not even read the title page. As a fraud investigator. You learn very early on that before you dive into the lies a man has written down on paper, you need to fully understand the context of how those papers ended up in your house. I needed to know who sent that anonymous text message. The number was a prepaid burner line. It was completely untraceable through standard means. But I did not need to trace the digital signal. I just needed to trace the logic. I sat back in the heavy wooden chair and thought about the absolute precision of the warning. Do not sign anything your son gives you this week. Whoever sent that message knew David's personal schedule. They knew the exact week he was planning to corner me. They knew the specific nature of the documents he was carrying. And they knew those documents were incredibly dangerous. But most importantly, they were terrified enough of David, or the people David was paying, to hide their identity completely. That eliminated anyone in my immediate social circle. It had to be someone internal. Someone working at the law firm David had hired to draft the paperwork. A senior partner would never risk their lucrative career to warn an old woman they had never met. It had to be someone lower on the ladder. A paralegal, a legal secretary, someone who handled the actual printing, the binding, and the endless proofreading. Someone young enough to still have a working conscience. And someone who had recently seen the final version of the documents. I opened my laptop. I went to the website of the high-end estate planning firm David always bragged about using. I pulled up their staff directory. Then, I used a very simple Internet Archive tool to look at what that exact same staff directory looked like just 1 month ago. There was only one discrepancy. A young woman named Sarah. Her photo was on the archived page under the title of Junior Paralegal, but she was completely scrubbed from the current live website. I opened a new tab and searched her name on a professional networking site. Her profile had been updated exactly 2 days ago. Her employment status had changed from working at the firm to actively looking for new opportunities. She had quit, right in the middle of the week, right around the exact same time I received that text message late at night. I did not text the burner phone. I did not want to spook her. I spent about 20 minutes running a standard public records search, the kind I used to do 10 times a day before my morning coffee, and I found her personal cell phone number. I called her on Friday morning. The sky outside was completely overcast, threatening a heavy storm. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was incredibly quiet and cautious. "Hello," she said. "I am Cordelia Whitmore." I told her, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely warm. "I believe you sent me a message a few nights ago. I would very much like to buy you a cup of coffee this afternoon." There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. I could actually hear her breathing. I could hear the hesitation, the fear of getting involved any deeper than she already was. "I will not bring my son," I added gently. "I will not bring any lawyers. It will just be me, an old woman who needs someone to explain what is happening to her. Please." Another 5 seconds of silence. Then, a very soft sigh. "Okay," she whispered. We met at 3 o'clock that afternoon at a rundown diner out on Highway 99. It was pouring rain by the time I pulled into the gravel parking lot. It was the kind of heavy, relentless gray rain that makes the whole world feel incredibly small and isolated. The diner was almost completely empty. It smelled faintly of old frying oil, burnt coffee, and stale bleach. I took a booth all the way in the back, facing the door. Sarah walked in 10 minutes later. She looked like she had not slept in a solid week. She was wearing a faded, oversized sweater, and her wet hair was plastered flat against her cheeks. She looked around the room frantically before she finally spotted me sitting in the corner. She slid into the vinyl booth across from me. I had already ordered her a cup of hot tea and a plate of toast. She wrapped both of her hands around the cheap, thick ceramic mug, but her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely lift it to her mouth. I did not push her. I did not demand answers. I just pushed a napkin across the table and waited. "Mrs. Whitmore," she started, her voice cracking slightly. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was not supposed to reach out to you. I signed a massive non-disclosure agreement when I left the firm on Wednesday. If your son finds out I talked to you, he could ruin my entire life. His lawyers are absolutely ruthless. He is not going to find out," I said quietly. Looking her directly in the eyes, I spent my entire professional life protecting whistleblowers. "Sarah, you are completely safe with me. Now, please, tell me why you quit your job." She took a deep, shuddering breath. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away aggressively. "I was the one who drafted the initial framework for your estate file," she explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When Mr. Whitmore, your son, first brought the request in, he told the senior partner it was just a standard tax shelter, a routine restructuring to protect your assets from the new federal tax hikes. That is what I built. That is what I typed up." She looked down at her tea, watching the dark liquid ripple as her hands continued to tremble against the table. But then, last Tuesday afternoon, His wife came into the office. Sarah continued. Elena. She sat down with the senior partner behind closed doors for 2 hours. When she left, the partner handed me a completely new set of revisions and told me to integrate them immediately. They wanted it rushed. They wanted it printed, bound, and finalized by Wednesday morning, so David could take it directly to your house. Sarah finally looked up at me. Her eyes were completely wide, filled with a mixture of absolute horror and deep, profound pity. Mrs. Whitmore, she whispered. I read the revisions. I read every single line they added. I have drafted hundreds of these documents in my short career, and I have never seen anything so aggressive. They are not trying to protect you from the government. They are trying to protect you from yourself. And if you put your signature on the last page of that stack, you are never going to be able to undo it. I sat back against the squeaky vinyl seat of the diner booth. The rain hammered loudly against the thin glass window next to us. The investigator inside me was completely awake now, calculating every single angle. But the mother inside me felt a cold, sharp pain bloom right in the center of my chest. What exactly did they add to the file? Sarah, I asked, my voice barely louder than the falling rain. She took one last, shaking breath. Everything, she said. Everything. That single word hung in the damp, heavy air of the diner. It felt louder than the rain hammering against the thin glass window next to us. I looked at Sarah. Her hands were still trembling around her ceramic mug, and her eyes were wide with a very specific kind of guilt. The kind of guilt that comes from being forced to build a trap for a person you know does not deserve it. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. I just kept my voice perfectly level and asked her to tell me exactly what was in the fine print. Sarah took a deep breath and began to explain. She did not have the physical papers with her. She did not need them. She had drafted them, revised them, and stared at them for days. She had the exact clauses burned into her memory. It is an irrevocable trust. Mrs. Whitmore, she whispered, leaning closer across the sticky table, but it is entirely weaponized. When Mr. Nature S. Whitmore first came in, it was a standard revocable family trust. That means you could change it, cancel it, or remove him as a trustee at any point if you changed your mind. That is normal. That is what families do. But after his wife came in and spoke to the senior partner, they changed it to irrevocable. She paused, swallowing hard. The moment your ink dries on the last page of that stack, you lose absolute legal ownership of everything you have ever worked for. She continued, your house, your savings, your pension distributions. It all transfers into the trust, and the new revisions name your son, David, as the sole, undisputed trustee with absolute discretionary power. You would not even have the legal authority to buy a new car or repair your own roof without his written permission. I sat completely still. I listened to the rhythmic hum of the diner's old refrigerator working in the background. The mother inside of me felt a cold, sharp blade slide right between my ribs. But the fraud investigator just categorized the information irrevocably trust, absolute discretionary power, loss of asset control. It was a classic, aggressive takeover strategy. But there is more. Is there not? I asked quietly. If they went to all this trouble, they did not just stop at the money. Sarah nodded, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. Page 47, she said, her voice shaking badly now. They buried it deep in the boilerplate medical directives where people usually stop reading. It is a springing power of attorney combined with a medical proxy, but the trigger conditions have been entirely manipulated. Usually, a doctor has to declare you mentally unfit for a proxy to take over your life. They changed the language. They made it so that David only needs the opinion of a private medical consultant hired by his own firm to declare that you are suffering from cognitive decline. She reached across the table and lightly touched my hand. If you sign that paper, Mrs. Whitmore, they do not just get your money. They get the legal right to force you out of your home. They can sell the house your husband built. They can put you in a managed care facility of their choosing and pay for it using your own savings, while they pocket the rest of the estate. And there would be absolutely nothing you rating, or the police, or any judge could do to stop them. Because you voluntarily signed the agreement, I looked down at my cold tea. I thought about David. I thought about the little boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my car. The boy who used to hold my hand so tightly when we crossed the street. I thought about the man who had stood in my kitchen just yesterday, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, tapping his finger nervously on my table and using his dead father's memory to trick me into signing my own life away. He was going to lock me away in a facility just to satisfy his wife's endless appetite for luxury. He was going to erase me. I looked back up at Sarah. She was terrified. She had thrown away a lucrative career at a top-tier law firm just to warn a stranger. That takes an incredible amount of courage. You did a very brave thing today. Sarah, I told her softly, you saved my life. I need you to know that I will not testify. She blurted out quickly, pulling her hand back. I cannot go to court against them. They will ruin me. They will blackball me in this city forever. I smiled a very gentle, very sad smile. You do not have to testify. I promised her. You do not have to do anything else. You have given me the map. I know exactly how to navigate from here. Go home. Apply for new jobs. Forget about the Whitmore family. I am going to handle my son. I paid for the tea. I walked out into the pouring rain and got into my car. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time before I put the key in the ignition. The rain was washing over the windshield, completely blurring the world outside. I let myself feel it then. Just for a moment, I let the crushing, suffocating weight of my son's betrayal wash over me. I cried for the boy I had raised. I mourned the family I thought I had. And then, I dried my eyes. I turned the key. I drove home. When I walked through my front door, the house was completely silent. I took off my wet coat. I walked straight down the hallway and into Robert's study. I sat down at the heavy oak desk. I turned on the brass lamp, and I pulled the thick, brown stack of legal documents right into the center of the leather blotter. I opened the top drawer and took out a bright red pen. I did not read as a mother anymore. I read as an auditor. I spent the next 3 hours dissecting all 50 pages. I found every single hidden clause Sarah had mentioned, and a few more she had missed. I circled the trapdoors. I underlined the financial mechanisms they planned to use to drain my accounts. I saw the exact architecture of the prison they had built for me, hidden beneath layers of dense, unreadable legal jargon. It was a masterpiece of corporate greed. It was beautifully drafted, utterly ruthless, and completely sociopathic. When I reached the final page, the one with the little yellow sticky note that said "Sign here," I set my red pen down. My hand was not shaking. My heart was not racing. I felt an absolute, chilling clarity. David and Elena had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a fragile old woman who would simply nod, smile, and surrender to the complicated paperwork. They forgot that I spent 40 years making a living by tearing complicated paperwork apart and ruining the men who drafted it. They wanted to play a game of legal chess, but they did not realize I owned the board. I picked up my phone. It was time to make a call of my own. I dialed a number I had not called in over 5 years. It was time to wake up an old friend. And it was time to build a trap of my own. The man I called that Friday night was named Marcus. He was 72 years old. And he had been a senior partner at one of the most ruthless, quietly powerful law firms in the city for over 3 decades. But long before he had his name on the glass door of a corner office, Marcus and I had spent the late 1980s dismantling a massive corporate embezzlement ring together. I was the investigator who found the hidden accounts, and he was the young, hungry prosecutor who used my evidence to put 5 very arrogant men in federal prison. We had a mutual respect that only comes from being in the trenches together. He knew exactly how my mind worked. And I knew that he was one of the very few lawyers in this city who could look at a 50-page contract and instantly spot the single drop of poison hidden in the ink. I drove into the city on Saturday morning. The heavy rain from the day before had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and gray. Marcus did not usually open his office on the weekends. But when I told him on the phone that my son was trying to strip my autonomy, he told me to meet him at 10 o'clock sharp. His office was on the 40th floor of an old, beautifully preserved Art Deco building. It did not look anything like the flashy glass and chrome spaces that David and his wealthy friends preferred. It smelled like lemon oil, old paper, and expensive leather. It was a room built on actual, generational power, not the desperate illusion of it. Marcus was waiting for me. He poured me a cup of black coffee, pointed to the heavy leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk, and sat down. He did not offer any empty platitudes. He did not give me a pitying look. He just held out his hand. I reached into my bag and placed the thick stack of documents squarely on his desk. The bright red ink from my late-night audit stood out sharply against the dense black text. I sat quietly and watched him work. It took him exactly 45 minutes to read through the entire file. The only sounds in the massive office were the distant, muffled hum of city traffic below and the sharp, crisp snap of the heavy paper every time he turned a page. I watched his jaw tighten. I watched the deep lines around his eyes grow harsher. When he finally reached the last page, the one with the little yellow sticky note instructing me to sign my life away, he took off his reading glasses and let out a long, heavy breath. He looked down at the documents for a few seconds. Then he looked up at me. "Cordelia," he said, his voice low and thick with a very quiet, very dangerous kind of anger. "I have seen hostile corporate takeovers that were more humane than this." He leaned forward, tapping his index finger directly onto page 47. "Your analysis is completely accurate," he continued. "This irrevocable trust is a masterpiece of manipulation. If you sign this, you are legally handing him the keys to your entire existence. The springing power of attorney clause is the most aggressive I have seen in years. They bypass the standard medical requirements entirely. He would not need a judge. He would not even need your primary care physician. He just needs a hired consultant to say you are slipping. And he can immediately liquidate your assets, sell the house Robert built, and stick you in a managed care facility." I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm now, but I barely tasted it. Hearing Sarah say it in the diner was a massive shock. Hearing Marcus, a veteran attorney, confirm it with absolute legal certainty felt like a heavy iron door slamming shut behind me. "So it is a trap," I said softly. "A perfectly legal, perfectly executed trap." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "It is only a trap if you step in it," he said. "And clearly, we are not going to let that happen. But the real question here, Cordelia, is not how they built it. The question is why. He was absolutely right. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. Fraud always requires three things: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. David clearly had the opportunity, and his blinding arrogance provided the rationalization. But what was the pressure? David runs a highly successful accounting firm. I told Marcus. Thinking out loud, he drives a car that costs more than most houses. He wears custom suits. Elena wears designer clothes and carries handbags that cost a small fortune. They just bought a massive new property out in the suburbs. Why would he need to steal from his aging mother? The estate is comfortable, but it is not millions of dollars. Why take the massive legal and moral risk for my house and my pension? Because the money is not real, Marcus said plainly. I looked at him, the investigator inside me instantly connecting the dots. People who actually have money do not act like your son and his wife. Marcus explained, gesturing toward the documents. People with real wealth do not desperately try to steal a modest family home to avoid a theoretical tax hike. This kind of aggressive, sloppy legal maneuvering reeks of absolute, blind panic. He is bleeding. Cordelia. Somewhere. Somehow. Your son is hemorrhaging cash. And he needs your assets to plug the hole before the entire ship sinks. A cold wave of realization washed over me. The nervous tapping of his fingers on my kitchen table, the heavy, manufactured urgency, the sheer desperation to get my signature by Friday afternoon. He was not trying to optimize an estate. He was trying to cover a massive, looming debt. I need to know everything. I told Marcus, my voice completely steady. I need a full, quiet forensic audit of his life. I want to know about his firm. I want to know about his personal accounts. I want to know exactly how much debt Elena has racked up on those credit cards. Do not break any laws. Do not tip anyone off. Just use your network and find me the numbers. Marcus nodded slowly. I can have a private investigator run a quiet financial background check by Wednesday. He said, but what are we going to do about these documents? He is expecting a signature. If you just flatly refuse, he is going to panic. And a panicked man might try something even more reckless. We play along. I said, I looked down at the red ink bleeding through the paper. I am going to call him on Monday. I am going to tell him that I got a little confused by the legal jargon. And I just need a few more days to read it over. I will act exactly like the slow, fading old woman he thinks I am. I will give him the false comfort of thinking he is still in complete control. I looked back up at Marcus. And while he is waiting for me to sign his trap, I want you to build me a fortress. I told him, I want you to draft a new trust. A real one. I want every single penny, every single asset, and the entire deed to the house locked down in an ironclad structure. I want to make it so that David cannot touch a single dime of my money. Not now, and not even after I am gone. Without going through an independent trustee. I paused, thinking of my grandchildren, thinking of the little boy and girl who lived in that massive, empty suburban house with parents who only valued money. But I am not going to destroy him. Marcus, I added quietly, I am a mother before I am an investigator. If he is drowning in debt, I am going to let him sink. I will let him lose the fancy car and the expensive suits. But I want the new trust to include a locked, untouchable educational fund for his children. I will protect my grandchildren. But I will not fund my son's lies. Marcus gave me a very small, incredibly respectful smile. Consider it done, he said. I will start drafting the new trust this weekend. It will be completely bulletproof. But Cordelia, when you finally drop this on him, it is going to be incredibly ugly. His wife is going to lose her mind. I am counting on it. I replied. I stood up, gathered my purse, and left the thick stack of David's lies sitting on Marcus's desk. I walked out of the heavy wooden doors, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stepped back out into the cool city air. For the first time in 5 years, the heavy, suffocating silence of my life felt completely gone. I was no longer a grieving widow waiting for her son to visit. I was an auditor, and the audit had officially begun. I called my son on Monday morning. I waited until exactly 10:15. Right when I knew he would be sitting behind his massive glass desk at his downtown office, likely drinking an overpriced espresso and pretending to be the master of his universe. I let the phone ring 3 times before he picked it up. His voice was completely professional, sharp, and I'm patient. David. Sweetheart, I said, making sure my voice sounded just a little bit thinner, a little bit more tired than usual. I am so sorry to bother you at work. The sharp impatience in his voice instantly vanished, replaced by that thick, artificial warmth. Mom? He said smoothly. It is never a bother. Did you get a chance to look over the restructuring paperwork over the weekend? I let out a long, very convincing sigh. I held the phone close to my ear and looked out my kitchen window at the quiet street. I did, I told him. But David, the print is just so incredibly small, and all of these legal terms are giving me a terrible headache. Your father used to handle all of this jargon. I just feel so easily confused by all these clauses about trusts and proxies. I am afraid I am going to mess something up. I could actually hear the physical relief washing over him through the receiver. I could hear him exhale a long, heavy breath. He had been terrified all weekend that the investigator in me would wake up and read the fine print, but hearing me play the role of the confused, overwhelmed widow was exactly what he needed to feel safe again. He mistook my fabricated vulnerability for absolute surrender. Oh, Mom, please do not stress yourself out over it, he said, his tone dropping back into that soft, patronizing rhythm. I told you. It is just standard boilerplate nonsense. The lawyers have to make it sound complicated just to justify their hourly rates. You do not need to understand every single word. Just focus on resting. If you need a few more days to feel comfortable, take until Thursday. I will have Elena come by and help you find the signature pages so we can get it filed by Friday afternoon. That is wonderful. David, I said softly. Thank you for being so patient with me. We hung up. I set the phone down on the counter. The false comfort was officially established. He thought he was giving a slow, fading old woman the illusion of control. He had no idea he was actually giving a veteran fraud investigator the exact amount of time she needed to completely dismantle his life. I did not have to wait long. By Wednesday afternoon, a private courier pulled into my driveway and handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope from Marcus's office. There was no return address. Just my name written in Marcus's sharp, elegant handwriting. I took the envelope into Robert's study, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and turned on the brass desk lamp. I broke the seal and slid the contents out onto the leather blotter. Marcus had kept his promise. His private investigator had performed a complete forensic autopsy on my son's entire existence. There were bank statements, credit reports, corporate tax filings, and internal memos from David's accounting firm. I spent my entire career tracking millions of dollars through complicated, international corporate mazes. Reading David's financial footprint was like reading a very sad, very simple children's book. It took me less than an hour to find the bleeding wound. David was not just in debt, he was entirely, catastrophically underwater. The beautiful, polished image of the wealthy corporate executive was nothing more than a hollow shell, completely held together by leveraged credit and blind panic. His accounting firm had lost 3 of its major corporate clients in the last 8 months. Without that steady revenue, the firm was actively missing payroll. To cover the massive gaps, David had taken out a series of aggressive, high-interest bridge loans. But instead of downsizing his lifestyle to weather the storm, he had allowed his wife to accelerate their spending to an absolute breaking point. I opened the file containing Elena's credit card statements and bank records. It was genuinely sickening to look at. While David's company was silently bleeding to death, Elena was busy spending $80,000 on custom Italian marble for a bathroom in their new suburban mansion. She had spent $50,000 on a luxury vacation to the Maldives just 2 months ago. There were endless, staggering charges for designer clothing, exclusive country club memberships, and high-end imported cars. She was treating his credit lines like a bottomless well, but the well had finally run dry. I found a copy of an email correspondence tucked near the back of the file. It was between David and a very aggressive commercial lender. David was begging for one final, massive loan to consolidate his debts and save his firm from total bankruptcy. The lender had flatly refused, citing a lack of viable collateral. Unless, the lender had noted in a follow-up message, David could secure a hard asset, something fully paid off, something incredibly stable, like a piece of prime real estate in a wealthy, established neighborhood, like my house. I sat back in Robert's heavy leather chair and let the absolute gravity of the situation settle over me. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together perfectly. Elena had found out about the impending bankruptcy. I could see it in the timeline of the bank records. As soon as the credit cards started getting declined, she had threatened to leave him. A woman who marries a man entirely for the logo on his luggage will never stay when the luggage has to be sold to pay the electric bill. She demanded that he fix it. She demanded that he maintain her illusion of extreme wealth, no matter who he had to destroy to do it. And David, terrified of losing the beautiful wife who functioned as his ultimate status symbol, had agreed to feed his own mother to the wolves. The irrevocable trust they had designed was never about avoiding government taxes. It was a weapon designed to steal my completely paid-off home, transfer the deed into David's name, and immediately leverage it to the commercial lender to secure the cash he desperately needed. The springing power of attorney clause was their insurance policy. If I ever found out and tried to fight the loan, they would simply hire a doctor to declare me legally incompetent, lock me in a managed care facility, and silence me forever. I looked down at the sprawling mess of financial ruins spread across my desk. When I first read the anonymous text message, I was incredibly angry. When Sarah told me about the trust, I was completely heartbroken. But sitting here now, looking at the exact numbers, looking at the sheer, pathetic desperation of it all, the anger completely evaporated. It was replaced by a deep, suffocating pity. My son was not a criminal mastermind. He was not a cold-blooded villain. He was just a profoundly weak, terrifyingly insecure little boy who had built his entire identity around the approval of a woman who did not actually love him. He was a coward, drowning in a storm of his own making. And he was trying to pull me under just so he could breathe for a few more seconds. I carefully gathered the papers and placed them back into the manila envelope. The investigator in me had all the evidence she needed to win the war, but the mother in me knew that when I finally dropped this bomb, it was not just going to destroy David's career. It was going to destroy his family. It was going to shatter the only world my 2 young grandchildren had ever known. Before I pulled the trigger, before I let Marcus unleash the legal consequences that would permanently end my son's financial life, I needed to see those children. I needed to look them in the eyes and make absolutely sure that the new trust I was building would protect them from the wreckage their parents were about to create. The trap was fully set. I just needed one more day of quiet before I burned their entire illusion to the ground. Thursday morning arrived with a bright, piercing kind of sunlight. The storm from the day before had completely cleared out, leaving the sky a pale, empty blue. It was the day before David expected me to hand over the keys to my entire life. And it was the day before his massive, lavish birthday party. But before any of that happened, I had a promise to keep. I had promised my grandchildren I would take them out for a morning at the park and a trip to the local bakery. I drove out to David and Elena's neighborhood around 9 o'clock. It was one of those exclusive, gated communities out in the deep suburbs where every single house looks like a small hotel. The lawns were manicured to absolute perfection. The driveways were impossibly long and lined with expensive, imported stone. There were no children playing in the yards. There were no neighbors waving over the fences. It was a completely sterile, beautiful vacuum of a neighborhood, built entirely for people who wanted to prove they were better than everyone else. I pulled my old, reliable sedan into their circular driveway, parking right behind Elena's massive luxury SUV. I walked up the wide stone steps and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Elena answered the door herself. She was wearing a flowing silk robe that likely cost more than my first mortgage payment. And she was holding a tall glass of some dark green juice. The moment she saw me, her entire face relaxed into a wide, completely unbothered smile. It was the false triumph again. She looked at me, and she did not see a threat. She saw a tired, obedient old woman who was going to sign a stack of papers tomorrow and solve all of her massive financial mistakes. "Cordelia," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The kids are just grabbing their coats. I am so glad you could take them for a few hours. I have an absolute mountain of things to organize for David's birthday dinner tomorrow night. You are still coming, right? And you are bringing that little packet of paperwork David left for you." She said it so casually. That little packet of paperwork. She was talking about my home. She was talking about my freedom. And she spoke about it with the exact same tone someone uses to ask if you remembered to bring the potato salad. I smiled back at her. A warm, utterly hollow smile. "Of course, Elena," I said softly. "I will bring everything David needs tomorrow night. You just focus on the party." Just then, I heard the rapid, heavy thud of small footsteps running down the hallway. My grandson, Leo, who had just turned 8, and my granddaughter, Maya, who was 5, came sliding across the incredibly expensive, polished Italian marble floor of the foyer. They crashed directly into my legs, throwing their arms around my waist. The physical impact of their little bodies hitting mine was the most real, grounded thing I had felt in days. We left the silent, echoing mansion and drove back toward the older part of town. I did not take them to a fancy, overpriced cafe. I took them to a small, loud, family-owned bakery that Robert and I used to visit 30 years ago. It smelled heavily of melted butter, roasted coffee, and cinnamon. We sat at a small, wobbly wooden table near the window. I bought them massive, warm cinnamon rolls covered in thick, sticky icing. I just sat there holding my black coffee, watching them eat. Maya was humming happily with her mouth full, completely covered in powdered sugar. Leo was telling me a long, rambling story about a bug he had found in the backyard. They were so incredibly innocent. They did not care about custom Italian marble bathrooms. They did not care about the logo on the front of my car. They just wanted to be listened to. They just wanted to be loved. I looked at Leo's eyes. He had the exact same dark brown eyes as David. I sat there in the warm, noisy bakery, and I remembered my son at that exact same age. I remembered David sitting at my kitchen table, struggling with his math homework, crying out of sheer frustration, and letting me hold him until he calmed down. I remembered the boy who used to build shaky wooden birdhouses in the garage with his father. How does a sweet, sensitive little boy grow up into a man willing to throw his own mother away to save his luxury cars? The answer was sitting right in front of me. It was the environment. It was the endless, suffocating hunger for more. David had surrounded himself with people like Elena, people who measured human worth strictly by financial output. And when you live in a world where money is the only thing that matters, eventually, people become completely disposable. If I simply signed those papers, if I let him steal my house to pay off his massive debts, I would not just be destroying my own life, I would be funding the very disease that was rotting his soul. I would be teaching him that his cowardice works. I would be proving to Elena that her manipulation is a valid strategy. And far worse than that, I would be allowing Leo and Maya to grow up in a house built entirely on a foundation of lies and stolen money. They would grow up watching their parents use people. They would absorb that poison, and the cycle would just continue for another generation. I reached across the table and wiped a smudge of icing off Maya's cheek with a napkin. She giggled and leaned into my hand. The investigator inside of me knew exactly how to dismantle David's life. But sitting there in the bakery, listening to the laughter of my grandchildren, the mother inside of me finally understood why I actually had to do it. I was not plotting a revenge tour. I was staging a rescue mission. Sometimes, the most profound act of love a parent can perform is to let their child hit the absolute rock bottom they built for themselves. David needed to lose the cars. He needed to lose the massive house. He needed to lose the shallow, empty woman who was driving him into the ground. He needed the entire illusion to shatter so he could remember what it actually felt like to stand on solid ground. And when the smoke finally cleared, I would make sure these two beautiful children were completely protected. The new trust Marcus was building would lock away a massive educational and living fund for Leo and Maya. David and Elena would never be able to touch a single penny of it. It would be an ironclad shield around their future. We spent 2 more hours at the park. We fed the ducks. We walked under the heavy oak trees. I held their small, sticky hands in mine, and I absorbed every single second of their warmth. I drove them back to the massive, silent mansion. Right before lunchtime, Elena opened the door, still holding her phone, barely looking up from the screen as the kids ran past her into the house. She gave me a brief, dismissive wave. "See you tomorrow night. Cordelia," she called out, already turning her back and shutting the heavy oak door. I stood on the stone steps for a moment, listening to the heavy click of the deadbolt locking into place. The sadness that had been lingering in the back of my throat for days was completely gone now. It was entirely replaced by an absolute, unbreakable resolve. I walked back to my car. I put the key in the ignition. The trap was fully set. The evidence was gathered. The new trust was already being drafted by Marcus. All that was left was the performance. Tomorrow night was David's birthday dinner. Elena had invited 30 of their wealthiest friends, business partners, and clients to their home. She was planning to use the evening to showcase their perfect, flawless life. She was planning to use the evening to secure the final piece of my destruction. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. I was going to bring her the paperwork, just like she asked, but it was not going to be the gift she was expecting. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, unseasonably warm breeze. By the time I pulled my old, reliable sedan up to the front gates of David and Elena's massive suburban estate, the sun had already set, and the house was completely illuminated like a modern art museum. The long, sweeping driveway was entirely lined with high-end luxury vehicles. There were actual valet attendants wearing crisp white shirts and black ties, rushing back and forth, parking cars that cost more than most people make in a decade. I handed my keys to a young man who looked at my car with a very polite, but very confused smile. I did not care. I walked up the wide stone steps, holding the thick brown manila envelope tightly against my side. The heavy double front doors were wide open, spilling warm yellow light and the sound of loud, forced laughter out into the night air. I stepped into the foyer. It was an absolute spectacle of manufactured wealth. They had hired a live string quartet to play in the corner of the massive entryway. Waiters, in matching uniforms, were silently weaving through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal glasses of champagne and tiny Versempen 8. Elaborate appetizers. I stood near the doorway for a moment, just watching the crowd. There had to be at least 40 people there. I recognized a few of them from David's accounting firm, but most of them were strangers. They were all wearing custom suits and designer dresses, holding their drinks, nodding vigorously at each other as they discussed stock portfolios, commercial real estate, and expensive summer vacations. I spent 40 years auditing corporate fraud. I have walked into boardrooms where millions of dollars were missing, and I have sat across from men who were completely bankrupt but still wearing $10,000 watches. I knew the exact smell of a sinking ship, and standing in that beautiful, polished foyer, looking at the sheer, aggressive extravagance of the party, the stench of financial ruin was absolutely overwhelming. They were burning money they did not have, just to prove to people who did not actually care about them that they were still financially relevant. It was a beautiful, tragic illusion. Elena spotted me before David did. She was wearing a stunning, backless emerald green gown that caught the light every time she moved. She excused herself from a conversation with two very wealthy-looking women and glided across the marble floor toward me. She had a wide, perfectly bright smile plastered across her face for the benefit of her guests. But her eyes were completely cold, and they did not look at my face. They darted immediately down to the thick brown envelope in my hand. "So glad you could make it, Cordelia," she said, her voice dropping into that familiar, dripping sweetness. She leaned in, her heavy designer perfume completely masking the smell of the expensive catering. "I assume you brought the paperwork. David has been so incredibly stressed taking care of you this week. We just really need to get this off his plate so he can actually enjoy his birthday tonight." She reached her hand out, completely expecting me to simply hand over my home, my savings, and my entire autonomy right there in the entryway, like I was handing her a damp coat to hang up in the closet. "Luz Comber," I looked down at her outstretched hand, then I looked back up into her eyes. I smiled, a very soft, very accommodating smile. "I brought exactly what David needs." "Elena," I told her quietly, keeping a firm grip on the envelope, "but this is family business. I am not going to hand over our estate planning in the middle of a crowded cocktail party. Where is my son?" For a fraction of a second, the perfect hostess mask slipped, her jaw tightened, and I could see a flash of genuine, ugly irritation in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, letting out a sharp, dismissive little sigh. "He is out on the back patio," she said smoothly, gesturing toward the massive glass doors at the end of the living room. "Go say hello. But please, Cordelia, just get it signed and handed over. Do not drag this out." I walked past her, moving slowly through the sea of expensive suits and glittering dresses. I found David standing near the edge of the beautifully lit swimming pool. He had a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand, and he was locked in an intense conversation with a man I recognized as a senior executive from a local commercial bank. The very same bank David had been desperately begging for a massive consolidation loan in those emails Marcus found. David was laughing, but it was a hollow, frantic sound. He looked immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit. But up close, the cracks were incredibly obvious. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes. His skin looked pale, almost gray in the patio lighting. His free hand was resting on the edge of a high cocktail table, and his index finger was tapping rapidly against the glass. Tap, tap, hey. Tap, tap. The exact same terrified, nervous rhythm I had seen in my kitchen the day he handed me the trap. He turned his head and saw me walking toward him. The physical transformation was instantaneous. It was the absolute peak of the false triumph. I watched his eyes drop to the thick envelope I was carrying, and I literally saw the rigid, suffocating tension drain completely out of his body. His shoulders dropped. The frantic tapping of his fingers stopped immediately. He took a deep, massive breath, letting it out in a long sigh of absolute, profound relief. In his mind, the war was entirely over. He believed I had signed the papers. He believed the house was legally his. The collateral was secured for his banker friend standing right next to him. And he was finally going to survive the storm. "Mom," he called out, his voice suddenly loud and booming with artificial joy. He excused himself from the banker and practically sprinted over to me. He wrapped his arms around me in a tight, theatrical hug, making absolutely sure the bank executive was watching him play the role of the devoted, loving son. "I am so glad you came," he whispered directly into my ear, his breath smelling heavily of scotch and desperation. "Is that it? Did you finish reading everything?" I pulled back slightly, looking up into his dark brown eyes, the eyes of the little boy I used to hold. "I read every single word. David," I told him, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "And I brought it all back for you." He reached for the envelope, a massive, genuine smile finally breaking across his exhausted face. But I pulled it back, just an inch out of his reach. "Not out here," I said softly, glancing around at the massive crowd of people drinking his stolen money. "This is your birthday present, but it is between you and me. Let us go inside. Take me to your private study. Shut the heavy doors, and I will give you exactly what you deserve." He did not hesitate for a single second. He just nodded, completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to win. He put his hand gently on the small of my back and began guiding me through the crowd, leading me away from the noise, away from the music, and directly toward the quiet, soundproof doors of his office. He thought he was walking in there to collect the keys to my life. He had absolutely no idea he was walking into a complete and total financial execution. David led me away from the bright, crowded patio and down a long WR dimly lit hallway toward his private home office. He pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and ushered me inside. The moment he closed those doors behind us, the thick, soundproof walls completely swallowed the noise of the party. The laughter, the clinking crystal, the live string quartet playing in the foyer. It all vanished instantly. The silence in the room was heavy and absolute. His office was designed to look like a room where incredibly important decisions were made. There were floor-to-ceiling custom bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes that I knew for a fact he had never actually read. There was a massive, dark wood desk sitting right in the center of the room, positioned perfectly to intimidate anyone sitting on the opposite side. David walked behind the desk and let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached for a crystal decanter and poured himself a heavy splash of scotch. His hand was trembling slightly. But this time, it was not out of fear. It was out of sheer, overwhelming adrenaline. He thought he had crossed the finish line. "Sit down." "Mum," he said, his voice thick with a forced, artificial warmth. He took a sip of his drink and smiled at me. "I am so glad we are finally getting this sorted out. You have no idea how much of a headache the new tax codes have been for the firm, but once my lawyer files this on Monday morning, you will be completely protected." I did not sit down. I walked slowly up to the massive wooden desk. I held the thick, brown manila envelope in my hands for just a few seconds longer. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes. I looked at the forced, desperate smile plastered across his face. Then, I laid the envelope down squarely in the center of his leather desk blotter. "Here is your paperwork." "David," I said softly. He set his scotch glass down so quickly that some of the amber liquid splashed over the rim onto the dark wood. He lunged forward, eagerly tearing the flap of the envelope open. He reached his hand inside to pull out the documents. He fully expected to flip straight to the back page, find my signature in blue ink, and lock the papers away in his safe. But I had not given him the clean, neatly bound stack of papers he had dropped off at my house. He pulled the 50-page document out of the envelope, and his hands immediately stopped moving. He stared at the top page. I had taken apart the binding, and every single page was completely covered in my bright red ink. There were massive circles around hidden clauses. There were sharp, precise lines striking through the manipulative legal jargon. There were margin notes written in my neat, aggressive handwriting, calculating the exact financial mechanisms of his trap. David stood completely frozen. He stared at the red ink as if it were actual blood pooling on his desk. "What is this?" he whispered. His voice was completely hollow. All of the booming, artificial confidence had evaporated into the quiet air of the room. "I told you I read it." "David," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, entirely devoid of any anger. "I read every single word." I paid very close attention to page 47, the springing power of attorney, the medical proxy, the little clause that would allow you to hire a private consultant to declare me mentally incompetent. I found the irrevocable trust provisions that would give you the absolute legal right to sell the house your father built, drain my savings, and put me in a managed care facility. I watched the physical transformation happen in real time. It was the exact opposite of the false triumph. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly after, pale gray. His shoulders collapsed forward. His breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off a ledge, realizing far too late that he forgot his parachute. "Mum, I can explain," he stammered, taking a small step back from the desk. "You do not understand the complex legal framework. The lawyer just put standard protective clauses in there. It is not what you think." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with him. I simply reached into my black leather purse and pulled out a second, much thinner folder. The one Marcus had given me. "I know exactly what it is." "David," I said, taking a step closer to the desk, You thought you were dealing with a tired old woman who could not understand a contract. You forgot that I spent 40 years pulling apart the lies of men who were much smarter and much richer than you will ever be. I opened the folder. I pulled out the first sheet of paper and slid it across the smooth surface of the desk, right over his ruined trap. It was a copy of the internal memo from his accounting firm detailing the loss of his 3 biggest corporate clients. Your firm is bankrupt. David, I stated plainly. You are missing payroll. You are surviving entirely on high-interest bridge loans that are coming due in less than 30 days. He looked down at the memo, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I pulled out the next stack of papers, the credit card statements, the bank records. I spread them out across the desk like a dealer laying out cards at a casino table. Elena has spent $130,000 in the last 60 days alone. I continued, my voice steady and cold. The custom marble, the luxury vacations, the designer clothes. You are funding a billionaire's lifestyle on a shattered credit line. She is bleeding you completely dry. And instead of telling her the truth, you decided to find a new source of cash. Then, I pulled out the final piece of paper, the printed copy of his email correspondence with the commercial lender. I placed it perfectly in the center of the desk, right under the harsh glare of his brass lamp. They refused your consolidation loan. David, I said, looking directly into his terrified brown eyes, unless you could provide a hard, fully paid-off asset as collateral. They told you they needed real estate in an established neighborhood. They told you they needed my house. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. It pressed down on the room, suffocating the last remaining ounce of arrogance out of my son. He realized in that exact moment that the game was completely over. He had brought a plastic knife to a gunfight against a veteran investigator, and I had just dismantled his entire life without raising my voice once. He sank down into his heavy leather desk chair. He looked incredibly small. The sharp, custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a costume draped over a frightened little boy. He buried his face in his trembling hands. Mom, please, he whispered, his voice cracking violently. I am drowning. If I do not get that loan by next week, the firm goes into receivership. The bank takes this house. Elena is going to leave me. I will lose everything. I was going to pay you back. I swear to you, I was going to pay it back. He was crying now. Genuine, desperate tears. I looked at him. The mother inside me felt a sharp, agonizing ache in her chest. But the auditor stood her ground. You are not going to pay it back. David, I told him quietly, you were going to lock me in a home and sell my life to buy your wife another season of luxury. I reached into the folder one last time. I pulled out a fresh, cleanly printed document. It was the draft of the new trust Marcus had finalized that morning. I laid it gently on the edge of the desk. This is my new estate plan. I explained. It goes into effect on Monday morning. Everything I own, every single penny, and the entire deed to the house your father built, is moving into an ironclad, independent trust. You are permanently and entirely removed as a beneficiary. You will never have the legal authority to sign a single document with my name on it again. You are locked out. David. Completely. He looked up at me through his tears. He looked completely shattered. So you are just going to let me lose everything? He choked out, his voice thick with a pathetic kind of betrayal. You are going to let them destroy me. I looked at the beautiful, lavish office. I thought about the 30 people standing out in his foyer, drinking champagne paid for by money he did not actually have. No, David, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. I am not going to let them destroy you. You already did that yourself. Now, you are going to sit here and you are going to figure out how to be a man when you do not have a single dollar left to hide behind. I turned around and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I did not look back. I did not need to. The audit was over, and the debt was entirely his to pay. I pulled the heavy mahogany doors of David's office shut behind me. The thick, soundproof seal locked into place with a soft, definitive click, trapping my son alone inside with the absolute wreckage of his own life. The moment I stepped back into the dimly lit hallway, the noise of the party washed over me again. The live string quartet was playing a bright, cheerful symphony in the foyer. The air smelled of expensive roasted meats, heavy perfumes, and fresh lilies. It was a beautiful, flawless illusion of massive wealth, and it was about to shatter completely. I walked slowly down the long corridor toward the main living area. I was not rushing. I felt an incredible, chilling sense of calm radiating through my entire body. Elena was standing near the entrance to the living room, holding a slender crystal flute of champagne. She was laughing loudly at a joke told by one of the bank executives. But as soon as she saw me walking out of the hallway, her laughter stopped. Her eyes immediately darted down to my hands. She was looking for the thick brown manila envelope. When she realized my hands were entirely empty, her perfect, practiced smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She quickly excused herself from the group and marched directly toward me. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the polished Italian marble floor, echoing the exact same impatient rhythm David used to tap on my kitchen table. "Did you give it to him?" she asked. Her voice dropped into a harsh, frantic whisper as she stepped close to me, completely invading my personal space. "Tell me you finally signed the paperwork." "Cordelia, we have the senior vice president of the commercial bank waiting out on the patio, and David needs to confirm the collateral right this very second." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I looked at her stunning emerald green gown. I looked at the massive diamond ring sparkling on her finger. I looked at a woman who measured her entire human worth by the price tags on her clothing. And I felt absolutely nothing but profound, freezing pity. I gave him exactly what he deserved. "Elena," I told her softly, "but if you want to know the specific details of your new financial situation, I highly suggest you go into that office and ask your husband." Before Elena could snap a hateful reply back at me, the mahogany doors at the end of the hallway slowly creaked open. David walked out. He looked like a ghost. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a massive cliff and was simply waiting to hit the ground. His skin was pale and completely drained of all color. He was sweating right through the expensive fabric of his tailored charcoal suit. His shoulders were completely slumped, and he stumbled slightly as he walked toward us. His eyes were wide, red, and entirely hollow. Elena took one look at him, and the sheer, undeniable panic finally set in. "David, what is going on?" she demanded, grabbing his arm forcefully. Her fingers dug into his expensive jacket. "Where are the signed trust documents?" He could not even look at her. He just stood there in the dimly lit hallway, listening to his wealthy friends laughing and drinking his stolen money in the very next room, and his ego completely shattered. He did not try to soften the blow. He did not try to spin a clever narrative. He did not try to hide behind his arrogance anymore. He just let the ugly, terrifying truth spill out onto the marble floor. "There are no documents." "Elena," he whispered, his voice cracking violently. "She did not sign them. She knows absolutely everything. She knows about the bankruptcy. She knows about the high-interest bridge loans. She knows about your credit cards. I watched Elena's face closely. I expected shock. I expected tears. I even expected her to loudly deny it, to pretend she had no idea what he was talking about. But she did none of those things. The mask of the loving, supportive wife completely vanished. Her face twisted into a rigid mask of pure, vicious rage. She let go of his arm instantly, pulling her hand back as if he were suddenly covered in a highly contagious disease. "What do you mean, she knows?" Elena hissed. Her voice was rising in pitch, getting dangerously close to echoing into the main party where their guests could hear. "You promised me you had this handled. You looked me in the eyes this morning and promised me you were going to secure the estate tonight. How could you be so incredibly stupid? I am completely bankrupt." "Elena." David choked out. Genuine. Heavy tears were openly running down his face now. "The firm is completely dead. The bank is going to take this house by the end of the month. We have absolutely nothing left. I tried to fix it, but I cannot. It is over din and day." She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not tell him they would figure it out together. She took a large step back, her eyes sweeping over his ruined, crying face with absolute unvarnished disgust. "You promised me a certain life. David." She spat, her words cutting through the air like broken glass. "I did not sign up to be the wife of a bankrupt failure. You are both pathetic. I am not staying on a sinking ship." Then she turned her venom entirely toward me. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger just inches from my face. "You stubborn old fool," she snarled, dropping every single ounce of her artificial sweetness. "You could have saved us. You have more money than you could ever possibly spend, sitting in that sad, dusty little house. And you are just going to let your own son lose everything out of pure spite." I did not raise my voice. I did not try to defend myself. I simply reached into my black leather purse and pulled out a small, neatly printed business card. I held it out to her, forcing her to look at it. "This is the direct contact card for my personal attorney, Elena," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of any emotion. "If you ever attempt to contact me again, if you ever try to access my grandchildren, or if you ever try to lay a single finger on the locked educational trust I just established for them, my lawyer will file a permanent restraining order against you before you can even pack your designer bags." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "My son made his choices," I continued, "and you made yours. Now get out of my sight." Elena stared at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds. She saw the absolute, unassailable finality in my eyes. She knew the game was completely over. And she knew there was not a single drop of blood left to drain from this family. She snatched the business card out of my hand. She did not say another word. She turned on her heel and stormed down the hallway. She marched straight past the living room, completely ignoring the 30 wealthy guests who were waiting to celebrate her husband, and walked right out the heavy double front doors into the dark night. She left her husband standing in the hallway, entirely alone. David watched her walk away, and then his legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor, pulling his knees up to his chest, and began weeping with the loud, ragged gasps of a man who had finally lost every single illusion he had ever built. The party in the next room was still going on, completely unaware that their host had just ceased to exist in the financial world they valued so highly. I stood there in the quiet hallway and looked down at my son. The auditor had completely finished her job. The fraud was exposed. The assets were fully protected. and the toxic elements had been entirely removed from our lives. But I did not reach down to help him up. Not yet. He needed to sit on that cold floor and feel the absolute weight of his own actions. I stood in the hallway and watched my son cry. I did not rush to comfort him. I did not pat his shoulder and tell him everything was going to be perfectly fine. When a man builds his entire life on a foundation of lies, you have to let the house collapse completely before you can even think about sweeping up the debris. The music from the string quartet in the foyer was still playing, but the bright, cheerful notes felt incredibly wrong against the heavy suffocating reality of the hallway. I could hear the murmur of the 30 guests starting to shift. They had seen Elena storm out the front door. They had seen her march down the long driveway, get into a waiting car, and leave her own husband's birthday party without saying a single word to anyone. The beautiful, flawless illusion David had paid so much money to maintain was breaking in real time. Right in front of the very people he was desperately trying to impress, David was sitting on the cold Italian marble floor, his expensive charcoal suit completely wrinkled and soaked in sweat. He was gasping for air, his hands clutching tightly at his chest. The absolute sheer panic of losing everything he thought made him valuable had completely broken him. He had spent the last 5 years believing that his worth as a man was entirely tied to his bank account, his zip code, and the designer label on his wife's clothing. And now, the account was empty. The house was lost, and the wife was gone. I let him cry for a long, agonizing time. I let him feel the absolute bottom of the pit he had dug for himself. I let him mourn the loss of his empty, hollow life. And then, I slowly knelt down on the marble floor right in front of him. I reached out and put both of my hands firmly on his shoulders. He flinched at first, pulling back slightly, like he fully expected me to strike him. He expected the same cold, vicious disgust that Elena had just shown him. But I did not yell. I just held him tight. "Look at me, David," I said softly. He raised his head. His dark brown eyes were completely bloodshot, his face red and swollen. In that exact moment, he did not look like a wealthy corporate executive. He looked exactly like the little boy who used to struggle with his math homework at my kitchen table. Terrified of failing, the arrogance was completely gone. The condescending tone was dead. "Elena is gone," I told him, keeping my voice incredibly steady. "And she is not coming back. Your accounting firm is going to fail. The bank is going to take this massive, ridiculous house. You are going to lose the luxury cars, the expensive country club memberships, and the custom suits. You are going to have to file for bankruptcy. And it is going to be the most humiliating, painful experience of your adult life." He let out a weak, pathetic sob, dropping his head back down toward his chest. "But I am not going to let you drown," I continued, squeezing his shoulders just a little bit tighter to force him to look at me again. "I am not going to pay off your massive debts. I am not going to give a single penny to the commercial lenders who funded your wife's endless shopping sprees. I will absolutely not fund your lies." He looked back up at me, his face twisted in absolute confusion. He had lived in Elena's toxic world for so long that he truly believed love and money were the exact same thing. He could not understand how I could flatly refuse to give him cash, after he had just tried to steal my entire estate, but still be sitting on the floor with him instead of walking out the door. "The new trust is already signed and filed," I explained quietly, making sure he understood every single word. "It is completely locked. Leo and Maya are entirely protected. Their future college tuitions, their medical care, and their basic living expenses are completely secured in an ironclad account that neither you nor Elena can ever touch. I made absolutely sure that my grandchildren will never have to pay the price for your massive mistakes. I reached into the pocket of my faded gray cardigan and pulled out a single gray cardigan, the single cardigan. Worn brass key. It was the spare key to my front door. The house Robert and I had built together with decades of honest, quiet labor. The exact same house David had just spent an entire week trying to steal from me. I reached out and placed the cold brass key directly into his trembling palm. He looked down at it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold on to it. When the bank finally comes to lock the heavy wooden doors of this mansion, I said, looking him directly in his terrifyingly sad eyes, when the creditors take the cars, and when you have absolutely nothing left to your name but the clothes on your back, you pack up your children and you bring them to my house. Your old bedroom is exactly the way you left it. He stared at the simple brass key sitting in his hand. Fresh, heavy tears started pouring down his face. But this time, they were not tears of panic or self-pity. They were tears of absolute, profound relief. He finally realized the massive difference between the woman who had just walked out on him and the woman sitting on the floor in front of him. I will not fund your lies, David, I told him, my voice cracking just a fraction as the mother inside of me finally let her guard down. But I will always roof your head when you tell the truth. You are my son, and it is incredibly time for you to come home and remember who you actually are. He completely collapsed forward, wrapping his arms around my neck, burying his face deep into my shoulder. He wept loudly, his entire body shaking, apologizing over and over again into the fabric of my sweater. I did not say another word. I just sat there on the cold marble floor of a house paid for by stolen money, and I held my broken boy until his breathing finally slowed down. The party outside eventually died down on its own. The wealthy guests realized the hosts were permanently missing. The expensive catered food grew cold on the silver trays, and the valets quietly brought the luxury cars around one by one. By the time I finally helped David stand up from the floor, the massive house was entirely empty. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and left. The quiet had finally returned. But this time, it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a hidden betrayal or a looming threat. It was the clean, empty silence that comes right after a massive, destructive storm finally breaks. I walked out the heavy double front doors alone. I got into my old, reliable sedan, and I drove back to my modest, dusty little house on the older side of town. I did not feel like a veteran fraud investigator who had just won a massive, complicated case. I just felt like a mother who had finally managed to pull her child out of a burning building before the roof completely caved in. The fallout from that night was incredibly brutal, and it was absolutely public. It has been exactly 14 months since I closed the heavy mahogany doors of David's office and walked out of his fabricated life. The collapse of his empire happened exactly the way I knew it would. It did not happen slowly. It happened all at once, like a massive glass building shattering completely under its own weight. The commercial bank moved in immediately. They seized the massive suburban mansion by the end of the month. They liquidated his accounting firm down to the very last leather office chair just to cover the high-interest bridge loans he had desperately taken out. It was a humiliating, entirely exposed financial execution. Elena filed for divorce exactly 3 weeks later. I was entirely right about her. A woman who builds her entire identity around the price tags on her clothing does not stick around to help you sweep up the broken glass. She did not even fight for full custody of the children. She demanded whatever small liquid assets were left, packed her incredibly expensive designer bags, and moved across the country to start looking for her next wealthy target. She completely erased herself from our lives without a single ounce of hesitation. David moved back into his childhood bedroom on a very rainy Tuesday afternoon. The luxury cars were gone. The custom charcoal suits were sold. He arrived at my modest, dusty little house in a cheap rental car, carrying nothing but 2 small suitcases of clothes and holding the hands of his 2 beautiful children. I did not gloat. I did not say I told you so. I simply unlocked the front door, let them in, and showed the children where they would be sleeping. For the first few months, the silence in my house was incredibly heavy. David barely spoke a single word. He walked around the hallways like a hollow shell of a man, actively mourning the death of his massive illusion. He had to learn how to exist without the constant, suffocating need to impress strangers. He had to wake up every single morning and look at his own reflection, knowing he had lost absolutely everything because of his own blinding arrogance and his pathetic cowardice. The bankruptcy hearings were devastating for him. He had to stand in a public courtroom, strip away every single layer of his fake corporate armor, and admit to a judge that he was completely broke. I went with him to every single hearing. I sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom. I did not offer to pay a single penny of his debts, but I made absolutely sure he knew he was not sitting in that room alone. And slowly, the absolute quiet of my modest home began to do its work. Leo and Maya adjusted faster than anyone else. Children are incredibly resilient, and they do not actually care about custom Italian marble or gated communities. They just want to feel safe. They loved my old, wobbly kitchen table. They loved the way the floorboards creaked in the hallway. They loved sitting on the counter while I baked thick cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings. For the very first time in their short lives, they lived in a house where the adults were actually paying attention to them instead of paying attention to their phones. Today is a bright, completely clear Saturday afternoon. I am sitting on my back porch, holding a warm cup of Earl Grey tea. I am looking out at my backyard, and I am watching my son. He is wearing a faded gray cotton shirt and a pair of old Copsis worn denim jeans. He is sweating heavily under the warm afternoon sun, pushing Maya on a wooden swing he built with his own 2 hands just last weekend. Leo is sitting in the green grass a few feet away, trying to catch a massive beetle in a glass jar. I watch David closely. The physical transformation is absolutely staggering. The deep, dark circles under his eyes have entirely vanished. His skin has color again. But the most important change is in his hands. The nervous, frantic tapping of his index finger is completely gone. He no longer checks his wrist for an expensive watch that isn't there. When Maya laughs and asks him to push her higher, he looks directly into her eyes and smiles. A genuine, unguarded, incredibly tired smile. He is finally present. He is completely here. He works as a standard bookkeeper for a small, family-owned hardware store downtown. Now, he makes an absolute fraction of what he used to make in the corporate world. He drives a reliable, 10-year-old, used sedan, but he comes home every single day at exactly 5 o'clock. He cooks dinner for his children. He helps Leo with his math homework at the very same kitchen table where he used to struggle with his own. He is finally becoming a father, because he no longer has any money to hide behind. I spent 40 years auditing corporate fraud. I spent my entire career finding the hidden poison buried in complicated paperwork and tearing down massive structures built on lies. But sitting here today, feeling the warm breeze against my face and listening to the beautiful sound of my grandchildren laughing in the yard, I realized that the most important audit I ever conducted was right here in my own family. I had to burn his entire fake world to the ground so he could finally learn how to stand on solid earth. The new trust I built with Marcus is working quietly in the background. It is completely locked. My assets are secure, and the educational fund for Leo and Maya is growing safely. entirely untouchable until they go to college. I protected the innocent, and I forced the guilty to pay their own debts. People often believe that setting fierce, uncompromising boundaries with your family is an act of extreme cruelty. They think it is selfish to refuse to help your own blood when they are drowning. But boundaries are not walls designed to keep your family out. Sometimes, they are the exact opposite. Sometimes, an ironclad boundary is the only foundation strong enough to rebuild a broken man. You cannot save someone by funding their lies. You can only save them by forcing them to survive the absolute truth. If you believe that true respect has to be earned, not just assumed because of a shared last name, please hit the subscribe button and drop a comment below. Have you ever had to walk away and let a family member hit rock bottom so they could finally wake up? Share your thoughts with me in the comments. I always read them. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, and I will see you in the next story.